كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم. أما بعد. I hope everyone's doing well. So welcome to lesson 12 of our deeper dive, as we've been calling it, into various things related to the history and development and Dala'il of the Hanafi madhab. For our last few sessions, we've been going through certain key works that discuss the Dala'il of the Hanafi madhab. So we've looked at the Al-Hujjah ala Ahl Medina of Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. We've also looked at the Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar of Imam al-Tahawi. And then our last session we looked at the Tajreed of Imam Quduri. Now what we're going to be doing now, inshallah, is continuing with this, but there's another genre of Dala'il which is not the same as what we've done so far. What we've done so far is looking at various evidences that have been provided for the Hanafi stance, and that includes a whole range of different type of techniques. So that could be, citing a verse of the Quran, then using usul. So if it's Aam of the Quran or Khas of the Quran, we look at ahadith, amal, aqwal al-sahaba, aqwal al-tabi'in maybe, qiyas. We look at methods of tarjih and different methods of tarjih, etc. And we find all of those within the text that we have looked at so far. This genre that we'll be looking at today, which is a genre of takhrij, is a bit more different in the sense that it is predominantly based upon a hadith, right? So not to say that it's completely absent from it or anything else, but it is much more dominantly focused on a hadith. And the science of takhrij, which we're going to be kind of delving into, the book that we'll be looking at, is we're going to begin with Imam Zayla'i's famous Nasb al-Raya, and then we're going to move on to a few works that have been done off the Nasb al-Raya of Imam Zayla'i. But before we're going to delve into that, I just want to kind of touch upon this topic of takhrij and the meaning of takhrij when used in different sciences, inshallah. Okay, so what does it mean by takhrij? Takhrij has a few different connotations, and so it's important to kind of be aware of it. And then, although it kind of overlaps in meaning, takhrij, it literally, what we're going to use it for in the English translation is sourcing. The sourcing of information, and more specifically, the sourcing of hadith. So that's why we say sometimes أخرجه البخاري في صحيحه. What we mean by that is Imam Bukhari mentions this hadith in his Sahih with isnad, and then if someone was to mention it without isnad, so let's say for example Imam An-Nawawi was to cite a hadith in the Riyadh al-Salihin, it would be incorrect to say أخرجه الإمام النووي في رياض الصالحين, because in that context the word ikhraj and even the word kharraja, which is more rarely used, but akhraj is a more commonly term used, will be if the person was to have mentioned it with a sanad, so therefore it becomes a primary source that you can analyze it through. So that's one idea of ikhraj or takhrij. For our purpose, or what is commonly used as takhrij, or as a science, let's say, before we move on to a specific point, some other points, is that books were written by numerous ulama. So for example, we saw last session the book of Imam Quduri, the Tajreed. Now the ahadith cited in Tajreed, predominantly Imam Quduri does not mention which book of hadith you can find those narrations in. He would just say, with the following sanad, this matan, following sanad, this matan. And he doesn't mention whether it's akhrajahu Daraqutni, akhrajahu Imam Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah. He doesn't mention that, at least not regularly. So therefore, when you have this kind of text, it's and you're a person reading them, you're really going to struggle to kind of work out where are these hadith, and if I want to go analyze them for myself, where can I find them? So that's where you get the fun of takhrij comes into play, which is that we use these previous books that have been written by ulama where there hasn't been that meticulousness in referencing the sources. So there's been some sort of shortcoming, or they've just said, it's mentioned in this hadith has come, and they haven't mentioned the sources, or they have not done any comprehensive way of sourcing them. Then the art of takhrij comes into play, is that a scholar comes and says, you know what, let me try to source all of these narrations. So they do takhrij of a book, right? They do takhrij of a book. So that's where what we're going to be talking about in our context when we're going to look at Imam Zayla'i's book and the subsequent books. That's what we mean, where a book has been written and then someone comes along and tries to source all those narrations. And that's an ongoing process. So the Tajreed or these other books that come out, any book of classical work that comes out now, most editions of modern most modern editions are going to have some form of takhrij done in it. So what I mean by that is, editor, any narration that's mentioned, they will go and they'll provide for you the sources to where you can find those narrations, right? They will provide the sources, and even sometimes in books in which there is already the author has mentioned already, Akhraj al-Bukhari, etc., they will then mention the exact page number or hadith number, or what they may even do is, because then there is different types of takhrij in terms of lengthy takhrij, which is exhaustive, where you try to mention all the sources you can find with the various asanid, and maybe even follow that up with a tahqiq al-isnad, which is analyzing the chain to say if it's authentic or not. You may want to do that. Or it can just be a very brief mentioning of the key sources without being exhaustive. So it can be, for example, if a hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim and it also comes in Ibn Majah and Nasa'i, you may not bother to mention Ibn Majah and Nasa'i because it's in Bukhari and Muslim. Or if a hadith is in Sunan Abu Dawud and Sunan Nasa'i, Sunan Abu Dawud, Sunan Jami' Tirmidhi, and then you find that the hadith is also found in the Musannaf Abdul Razak, you may not want to mention Musannaf Abdul Razak, right? Or you want to mention all the hadith as possible. You can mention all of them, all the sources, and then you may want to go into it more long, as I mentioned, and do tahqiq al-isnad as well. But so that's the idea of takhrij, and there's different styles with the level of exhaustiveness. And there's no, to be honest, right or wrong answer of the manhaj, or all is permitted. Rather, to provide a critical edition of a book, which is called a Taba'atul Muhaqqaqa, that doesn't actually require takhrij. It's kind of assumed, but doesn't require takhrij, because a critical edition, all it means is that you present the original text by comparing multiple manuscripts meticulously, and you present the most correct rendition of the text, right? So if I get a hold of, I don't know, let's say I got a Tajreed of Imam Quduri, and I went through the various manuscripts and I meticulously typed it up, compared them, and then the differences that were between the different manuscripts I mentioned in the footnotes very carefully, and so I present that text. That's called a critical edition. That's called a good edition. That's what we mean when the scholars, they mention good editions. That's what they actually mean by it's a critical edition, where the text has been presented in a critical manner. And we kind of assume a takhrij to be done with that, but takhrij is not a necessary characteristic of a muhaqqaq edition, right? You can actually have very good muhaqqaq editions without any hawashi, but when a student of knowledge or a student in a madrasa, etc., when they say good copy, a good edition, what they're usually kind of referring to is that, are there useful remarks mentioned by the muhaqqiq? What has the muhaqqiq added in the footnotes? Has he done takhrij? Have they graded the hadith? Have they given us the biographies of the figures mentioned therein, and whatever, right? That's what they kind of look at for a good edition. But in terms of a critical edition, which is called Taba'atul Muhaqqaqa, it's the first time that we're looking at. Anyway, so that's the different ideas of takhrij, that word that is kind of thrown around, which is the last one being sourcing a hadith. So if I mention a hadith, you do takhrij of it, and that's called sourcing a hadith. Now, there's other meanings of takhrij as well. You find in the journal of Thabt, of Athbat, but that's not what we're interested in us right now. Okay, so let's move on now to the meaning of takhrij that we mentioned, is where there is an earlier book which has not been referenced, right? The hadith I mentioned therein, but it's not clear where the author got their hadith from. So then a later scholar comes along and tries to source those narrations. So they kind of reproduce the text. If not reproduce the whole text, they might just have some sort of thing, chapter 1, and this is the hadith mentioned, and then they will give a detailed analysis of where you can find that hadith, and sometimes they would even add comments about the isnad, about what scholars of hadith have said, and they will try to provide what they could regarding that given hadith. Okay, so famous books of takhrij that kind of were written during so Imam Zayla'i, Iraqi, Ibn Hajar, this era, you start to see this fund of takhrij really kind of come into fruition. And you have the famous book of Imam Al-Ghazali, Ihya Ulumuddin, has got a very famous takhrij of it done by Iraqi, right? By Iraqi, he's got a takhrij on the book of Ihya. So therefore, if you're reading Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, a lot of the scholars, when they're reading it, or some of their current editions, under each hadith they will mention the comments of Iraqi. So Iraqi will say, this hadith is mentioned by so-and-so. Iraqi has a brief one, and then he started a more comprehensive, which he didn't complete. A single volume of that is published. So that's a famous takhrij done by Iraqi, but that's a book on tasawwuf, Ihya Ulumuddin. And that was a major khidmah, because the Ihya of Imam Ghazali became quite infamous for, despite the amazing, the amazing discussions in the Ihya, there was a problem where many of the narrations therein, scholars put question marks on, saying, where is this narration, or is it even authentic, is it weak? And so because Ghazali mentioned very little regarding the ahadith and the sources, it did become a major problem of how to engage with the book of Ihya, with numerous scholars pointing that out, saying this is a major problem. So with Iraqi's takhrij, it kind of saves the Ihya, where you can read through it through the lens of Iraqi and say, okay, this hadith is sahih, that's fine, this hadith da'if, or this hadith you couldn't find. So you can kind of distinguish, and so when you read the Ihya, you can benefit more, because you know which parts to kind of be careful of and which parts you can take wholeheartedly. Ibn Hajar, of course, has numerous takhrij works. The scholar that we're looking at, which is by far probably the most famous takhrij work in the Hanafi madhab, and not just the Hanafi madhab, in the genre of takhrij, probably the most famous work is written by Imam Az-Zayla'i. Imam Az-Zayla'i, and this book is named Nasbur Raya, right? Nasbur Raya li Ahadith al-Hidayah, which is actually not the correct name of the book. It's not actually the correct name of the book. The book is actually called Takhrij Ahadith al-Hidayah, and it's been misnamed by later scholars, thinking that the book's name is Nasbur Raya. This was actually a bit of a mistake. There was a later book written by Ibn Hajar on the book of Zayla'i, which was actually entitled Nasbur Raya, as well as another title, and people thought it was referring to this work. But for our purpose, because the book is well known as Nasbur Raya, it's on the front cover as well. So we're not going to try to confuse people. When we say Nasbur Raya, we're just going to refer to Zayla'i's work, inshallah. Now, we're going to look at the Nasbur Raya, and then in the next session we're going to look at some of the subsequent works and some of the background to the Nasbur Raya and the other takhrij works in Hanafi texts, because Imam Zayla'i, there are some works previous to him and there's some books that come after him. There is for those, whenever you're listening to this, I do have a podcast on the topic of one of the texts like this called Al-Inaya. I believe it's episode 2, on the topic of on this. If you were to go on YouTube to Imam Zakaria Academy podcast, or Imam Zakaria Academy YouTube, you'll find episode 2. I discussed this in a bit more, some of the aspects more detail. But that book we are going to be looking at briefly, this other book called Inaya, in the subsequent session, inshallah. But we're going to try to dedicate today's session to Imam Zayla'i, because he is the most famous. So instead of trying to blur some of the lines, we're saying, well, there's this imam and that imam, and this person did this, person did this. We're going to focus in on two things. One is the need for this takhrij work, right? And then why it was so significant. And if you have time in this session, we will go through just a section of it to show you what how the style of the author is. So number one is that what we notice is, if you remember going back to the Tajreed of Imam Quduri, there's also other books like the Asrar al-Sharia of Imam Abu Zayd al-Dabusi, who I mentioned in the previous sessions, talking about the first semester, regarding the key works in Hanafi usul. We had mentioned the Fusul fil Usul of Jassas, the Usul al-Saraqsi, the Usul al-Bazdawi, and Usul al-Dabusi. This same Imam Abu Zayd, Qadi Abu Zayd al-Dabusi, has also got a book on Khilaf, similar to how Tajreed is, called Asrar al-Sharia. So this book, Quduri's work, then you got Imam Saraqsi's Al-Mabsut, right, and other such works. They, as you see, they cite a number of narrations. We looked at some example Tajreed, but you can easily open up Asrar al-Sharia, which has now been published and recently, and then Mabsut Saraqs has been published, decades ago. So you can open these works up and you'll see a lot of the times they'll say كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كذا كما قال ابن عمر كما قال فلان, and they'll mention these narrations. But one thing you'll kind of notice is that none of them are sourcing their ahadith. There's not any clear references to where they're citing it from. And when Imam Marginani comes along and he writes his work Al-Hidayah, right, which is his own commentary on a matan, which is a mix between Imam Muhammad's work and Mukhtasar Quduri, he seems to be using these works that come before him. These are like ahadith which are well known within Hanafi circles, and he utilizes them in his text. It doesn't seem like Imam Marginani was going through the works of hadith and then kind of citing the relevant narration. So it wasn't like, okay, I want to go into the mas'ala of Raf'ul Yadayn, I want to go to the mas'ala of does bleeding break the wudu, and so let me go and see what does Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, and go through this ahadith and see if I can find a narration which kind of corroborates the Hanafi position. That doesn't seem like that's what Imam Marginani did. Rather, he went through previous Hanafi texts to see what narration did they cite, and then he cites them in his Hidayah. Right, so text that he sees, hadith that he sees cited there, he cites them within Hidayah, and this is even for the opponent. So even like when it comes to Shafi'i narrations, it's not as if he's very meticulous there. It's whatever comes in the books of the Shafi'is or mentioned by the Hanafis as a Shafi'i evidence, he will cite them saying, "Wali Shafi'i," right, or "Walahum," "Walana." For us is this evidence for them, and a lot of the times he's not actually citing from Hanafi. From the hadith books directly. He's kind of cited from the well-known narrations within the books of fiqh, right? Within the books of fiqh. So a big question mark then comes about is, can you trust these hadith, right? The hadith that Imam Marginani has cited, what are you meant to do with it? And even today, when students are studying books like Hidayah, they come across this very like a problem where if you have like a short takhrij or hukam on the hadith, they will say, Imam Marginani says, for us, the Hanafis have this narration. And then you go in the footnote and they'll say something like, أخرجه Imam Daraqutni fi sunnah, or fi sunnah Daraqutni wa isnadu da'if. Right? And then a student usually looks at that and they say, that's a bit of a problem, because does that mean our madhab is based upon weak evidences? Right? How does one reconcile the fact between a narration that has come used by the Hanafis and the fact that it is da'if? Shouldn't we discard those narrations and in essence then discard those masail? Now there is a problem here with this rationale. Before even looking at whether the hadith can be utilized or not, or the level that we should assign to the hadith mentioned in Hidayah and the solution to it, and the way Imam Zayla'i comes into the picture, before we even delve into that topic as a form of solution, this method of approaching fiqh itself is a highly problematic method of approaching fiqh. What do I mean by that is, the Hanafi mas'ala is not necessarily based upon, so when Imam Abu Hanifa argues a case for something, there could be a specific argument he has in mind which does not, in essence, require us to dismiss a hadith or even utilize a specific hadith. Right? So for example, we have the ruling of ghusl. And the ruling of ghusl in the Quran and the Sunnah is that you have to drench your whole body in water. So then the question is, does a person have to put water in their mouth and nose? Well, Imam Abu Hanifa is saying, well, if you have to drench your whole body in water, the idea is wherever water reaches, right? Which is not, there's no ta'adhur, no hardship in getting water there. So if I have to put water, is it hardship to put water in my nose and mouth? There's no. So that becomes part of the fardiyah of ghusl. Now, if you can provide a specific narration to that, so let's say I say, and I do believe this is an actual example, that I provide a hadith, and the hadith says, in ghusl, you must do madmada wastinshaq. And then it turns out that the hadith is da'if. So what happens sometimes, the student may read that as an example. I believe it's a real example. I'm doing it off the top of my head, I recall it, but I may be mistaken, but the idea is true. I can give, if you don't take too long, I can find proper examples for this anyway, if this is not accurate. But the idea is that as a Hanafi student, you say, what's our evidence for placing water in the mouth and nose? Now, if you're a scholar and you say that you find that there's a prophetic hadith being cited, you're not going to be interested in the other rationale. You say, well, there's a prophetic hadith, here it is. Now the student goes and takes that hadith and maybe looks up in a hashia or looks up in a work or Googles it or whatever, right? And then they say, well, this hadith is da'if. Why is it da'if? Because so-and-so narrator is weak, or so-and-so narrator is munkar, or whatever they give the hukam of. And you look at it and you think, okay, do we disregard what the muhaddithin are saying, or do we accept them? And then you get these kind of very tricky grounds where, how do I deal with the kalam of the muhaddithin regarding this hadith when it seems to be opposing our madhab? So you get into a very sticky situation. Now the reality here is that there is no evidence that this is the reason why Imam Abu Hanifa said what he said. The reason seems to be is that you're supposed to drench yourself in water, and it only makes sense that you apply water through the mouth and the nose. I don't need to have specific evidence for that, right? It's like me saying, drench yourself in water, but do I have to get from behind the ear? Right? You say, well, of course, that's the assumption. But can you provide a specific evidence? And if I provide a specific evidence saying you have to get the water behind the ear, and it turns out to be da'if, does it affect the mas'ala? No. Having that hadith can, of course, if being authentic, would clarify any misconception or any doubt, but I don't actually need that hadith for that mas'ala. Likewise, we talk about bleeding, etc., right? In wudu, breaking it, because we've got the usul of khuruj al-najasa. Now, if you can provide a specific narration reiterating that point, then great. But even if you don't have that hadith, the mas'ala still stands on its own. Right? So that's an important, preliminary remark to mention when dealing with such narration, dealing with these ahadith in the books of fiqh. Right? So two things to take from that is that the books of fiqh, a lot of them, they are using previous books of fiqh for citations, not direct engagement with the literature of hadith. That doesn't seem to be there. And if they were, they're not actually mentioned the direct sources themselves. And number two, the ahadith they cite is not necessarily the evidence that the Hanafis are using. Many a times the Hanafis have another way of looking at the mas'ala. This hadith, because the apparent wording directly supports it, they may mention that narration. So that narration being da'if does not affect the Hanafi ruling. That's an important point to note, where a lot of people make mistakes. Okay, so now we can move on to the work of Imam Zayla'i, which is shown here. This is in a 4-volume edition. This is a republication of Dar Nawadir. This was done by حقق هذا الجزء وعلق عليه الشيخ عبد العزيز الديوبندي الفنجابي وقابله على أصول الخطية وأشرف على طبعته الشيخ أحمد رضا البجنوري العلامة محمد يوسف بن نوري, and then there was further corrections made over it and an introduction by Allam Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari. We'll come back to this inshallah in a second. This is a 4-volume copy, and there's a republication of it by Sheikh Awama. Now, Sheikh Awama, in his edition of Nasb al-Raya, he's kind of added his own introduction in there where he gives a biography of the likes of Imam Zayla'i, Ibn Humam, Qasim and Qutlubagha. So I'm just going to be reading a bit briefly from Sheikh Awama's a short bio of Imam Zayla'i, so that you can get a bit of a feel of what he's saying. This is also translated in English by Mufti Muntasir Zaman. Just easier just to read from the translation rather than having to read the Arabic translation. But you can find this written in Arabic by Sheikh Muhammad Awama. So he says he's an Imam, prolific hadith memorizer and authority, Jamaluddin Abu Muhammad Abdullah ibn Yusuf ibn Yunus ibn Muhammad al-Zayla'i al-Hanafi. So he's one of the leading Hanafi experts of the 8th century, known for his expertise on hadith. There's not that's where his main focus was on hadith. His contributions outside of that are very minimal. There's not clear date of his birth, and Sheikh Awama goes, I've not come over like someone who specified it. Suyuti writes, the place of his entry in the following generation I mentioned earlier only because his demise was earlier. So we're saying refers to the quotation in generation of Hafiz ibn Rajab, Ibn Musallam, and Ibn Sayyid al-Nas. So just to see the generation he comes under, that Suyuti puts him in, is the generation Ibn Rajab. Ibn Rajab is born in 736 Hijri and dies in 795. Ibn Musallam 724, 792. Ibn Sayyidina 729, 792, which means you can say that he was born around the year 720 Hijri. Alright, anyway. In Nasb al-Raya, Azayli frequently calls Ibn Daqiq al-Eid al-Imam, and in such case he mentions the Sheikh said, and not once does he say our Sheikh said. Ibn Daqiq al-Eid passed away in 702, so that means that you can assume that Zayla'i was someone who came after, and because Ibn Daqiq al-Eid was not from his mashayikh. Who are the teachers of Imam Zayla'i? The following are some of the teachers. One is Imam Fakhruddin Uthman ibn Ali al-Zayla'i, who died in 743. He is the famous author of Kanz al-Daqa'iq, called Tabyinu Haqa'iq. So some people sometimes get confused when they say Tabyinu Haqa'iq by Zayla'i. They think he's talking about Jamaluddin al-Zayla'i. No, that's his teacher, Uthman ibn Ali al-Zayla'i. Anyway, and he's also quoted by Imam Zayla'i in Nasb al-Raya. You have another Shaykh Shamsuddin Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Adlan, died 749. And then you have Shihabuddin Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Qais al-Ansari, and Bahauddin Abdullah ibn Rahman ibn Aqil, the commentator of Alfiya ibn Malik. As for teachers in hadith, from his teachers was Imam Jamaluddin al-Mizzi, who died in 742, the great Imam, the one who wrote the Tuhfat al-Ashraf and Tahdhib al-Kamal, one of the two most, you can say one of the most important books in Ilm al-Rijal and Atraf, right? Tahdhib al-Kamal is in books of Rijal, and then you have the Tuhfat al-Ashraf, which is one of the greatest books written on Atraf of Hadith. Also, Imam al-Dhahabi comes under his teachers. Zayla'i constantly utilizes his book Mizan al-I'tidal. And then you have Imam Alauddin al-Mardini, who Zayla'i quotes frequently but critiques every time. He had great work. Scholars had praised him. Anyway, we just move on from that. He was a great scholar. I'm not going to read all the praise. Works, just to kind of look at the works that he's written. The first book to know is Al-Is'af bi Ahadith al-Kashaf, where he sourced the Hadith al-Zamakhshari's Tafsir al-Kashaf. So Kashaf, the famous author Zamakhshari, the Hanafi scholar who was a Mu'tazili, wrote a commentary on the Quran, and this Tafsir al-Quran cites narration. So Imam Zamakhshari, he wrote a takhrij of this work. He also has annotations of Maqasid Hasana. Sheikh Awam says, our teacher, the learned hadith scholar Sheikh Abdullah ibn Siddiq al-Ghumari, describes work as a beneficial and lengthy takhrij work. This is a description of one who is well versed with its contents because he was possessing the manuscript of the form. Then Hafiz ibn Hajar summarized this book, just as he summarized Zayla'i's takhrij in the hadith of Hidayah, entitled Al-Kaf al-Shaf bi takhrij hadith al-Kashaf. Now, Sheikh Imam Ibn Hajar, he did a summary of Zayla'i's book on the takhrij of Kashaf, and then he done also, we're going to come to later, a takhrij of, a summary of this book, Nasb al-Raya. He's got a summary of that. And then finally, he says the second book is the Mukhtasar Ma'ani Athar by Imam Tahawi. While discussing scholarly activities surrounding Shaykh Ma'ani Athar, Allama Kawthi mentions this and writes, Hafiz Zayla'i is also amongst those who summarize the book. His summary is preserved in Ruwaq Atraq Library and Kaprulu Library in Istanbul. The third book is Nasb al-Raya Hadith al-Hidayah, which will be studied in detail. So that's the third work. So there's three major works of Zayla'i. One is his takhrij of Kashaf, and then you have his sorry, you know when I said annotation of Maqasid Hasana? Yeah, that's not that was Abdullah Ghumari's annotation of Maqasid Hasana praises the book of Zayla'i. Sorry, my mistake. So you have the Takhrij of Tafsir Kashaf. Then you have a book which is a Mukhtasar of Sharh Ma'ani Athar, which I've not seen published yet. It may come out soon. I've not seen it. So I'm not sure if there's additional comments on it. I've not looked into that. And number 3 is our book. So there's 3 works. All 3 you can see are hadith related. One of the things that kind of stands out for Imam Zayla'i is his what they call insaf, his justice, in the sense that if there is a narration cited by Imam Marginani, the author of Hidayah, which seems to be problematic, Imam Zayla'i is not going to go out of his way to try to authenticate it. So he's seen as very just in his hukm, saying this is da'if, he will say, this is very weak, or he couldn't find these alfaz. He wouldn't try to mess around with the nusus to try to justify the positions or the citations of Imam Marginani. So he was off-cited by numerous scholars for his insaf, for his justice. And that's rare for a scholar, especially who's engaged in such a field, to be described as such, because naturally biases come into fruition. So when someone's described as being just, munsif, it's actually quite a unique it's actually quite by mukhalif, meaning it's actually quite a unique characteristic. So for example, Imam Abdul Laknawi in the Hanafi madhab as well, he is described as being a munsif, right? And it's because it's a rare quality to be described by your opponent. Not saying that everyone is not munsif, not just, but to be described by your opponents as being munsif, that's quite rare. All right, so anyway, so he's one that has been described as such. In closing the entry of Zayla'i's, Ibn Fahd writes, this is making his death date now, he, may Allah be merciful, and passed away on the 11th of Muharram in 762 Hijri, and that was in Cairo. No one specified the location of his grave. Based on the estimation apostrophe of the year of his birth, he lived for 40 years. So meaning, because he's speculated, so it's not clear, if you had to assume that he was born in 720 and then passed away in in the 720s, rather, it doesn't say 720 per se, but he passed at 762, then we're looking at around 40 years. So it's quite extremely young by that estimation. And even if we go a bit earlier and say 710 he was born, that's still a 50-year-old scholar, which is not that significant of lifetime. But 40 does make sense as well, because you only got 3 works, 2 major works of his, and maybe if he did live a longer life, you maybe expected more works. So that kind of fits into that. Allah knows best, but it does show you that a person can achieve great things if you put your mind to it, even with a shorter time. If you do get opportunity in this semester to go through Laknawi, I will also kind of touch upon him, because he also uniquely died quite young at the age of 39 or just touching 40, and Laknawi's scholarship is well attested to in a number of fields. But anyway, that allows us to kind of move into describing now some of the book. Now, the Nasb al-Raya, if you buy the Nasb al-Raya, usually the editions are going to come with the Muqaddimah written by Imam Zahid al-Kawthari. So the 2 scholars that I mentioned here who worked on the book was Sheikh Ahmed Rida Bijnouri, who is a son-in-law of Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri, and then Allama Yusuf bin Nouri, the very famous scholar, who's also a student. He's a student of Allama Anwar Shah Kashmiri, so both are connected to them. And they got into contact with Imam Kawthari, so they're working on this Nasb al-Raya, and they get into friendship with Imam Kawthari, and they start to engage with, to exchange letters and works and books. Them two being younger, obviously, so they kind of see Imam Kawthari as an ustad. These letters, at least Kawthari's letters to Mullah Yusuf bin Nouri, have been preserved and been published, an amazing work that I would highly advise everyone to read. But they kind of request Imam Kawthari to write a Muqaddimah to the work. This Muqaddimah, which published alongside Nasb al-Raya, was then published separately, known as Muqaddimah Nasb al-Raya or Fiqh Ahl Iraq. And this Fiqh Ahl Iraq can be seen as a distinct book. It's not really an introduction to the specifics of Nasb al-Raya. It's just more of a general introduction to Hanafi fiqh, Hanafi hadith, and so that's what he does in this work. So this session kind of summarizes up like that, in the sense that we've kind of gone through the idea of what takhrij is. We've kind of also looked at the significance of the art of takhrij, specifically some of the concerns regarding Imam Marginani and the state of hadith at that time, and then the books that were then how that kind of fits into the need for something like Imam Zayla'i to come and source the hadith of Hidayah. And we kind of also dabbled into the life of Imam Zayla'i very briefly, and kind of introduce his work, the Nasb al-Raya. We also looked at some of the, meaning the 2 scholars, Mullah Yusuf bin Nouri and Mullah Allama Ahmad Rida Bijnouri, their work on them working hard to publish the Nasb al-Raya with the introduction written by Imam Zahid al-Kawthari. With that in mind, just a couple of concluding remarks, inshallah. What we're going to do following session is we're going to go through a few sections of the Nasb al-Raya, so you get a feel of how he writes, and then we're going to also look at some of books that are written working off the Nasb al-Raya, and that we're going to show you guys, inshallah, and how a student can actually utilize these works. When do they come into use? We'll kind of look at all of that as well, inshallah. Any other concluding remarks to add to that? Is that one of the significance of Nasb al-Raya is that because the hadith he touches upon are all the hadith in Hidayah. And remember, Imam Marginani cites hadith of the Mukhalif as well, of the opponents, the Shafi'i narrations. So because he does takhrij of all of that, this becomes a vital source, not for just the hadith that the Hanafis use, but hadith al-Ahkam in general. Right? The hadith al-Ahkam in general, it becomes a very vital text. There is a similar genre of this that takes place in the Shafi'i madhab as well, where you got people like Ibn Mulaqin, Ibn Hajar, and these imams participating in, which we'll briefly touch upon. But these works become useful because they not only just deal with the Hanafi hadith ahkam, but hadith ahkam in general. So people from all different madhahib constantly cite the work of Zayla'i, right? Scholars of different madhahib, they constantly cite the work of Zayla'i because many of the ahadith they want to utilize in ahkam, Imam Zayla'i has done a thorough takhrij, a sourcing of, inshallah. So we'll look at that in the subsequent section. We'll stop here for now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.